On July 25, 1946, the American aircraft carrier USS Saratoga was still sitting on the surface of Bikini Atoll's lagoon. She had survived World War II. She had survived the first atomic blast. But within hours, the ship would disappear beneath the water. Saratoga was not just an old carrier chosen at random. She was one of the most important American aircraft carriers of her generation. During World War II, her aircraft flew thousands of combat missions across the Pacific. After Japan surrendered, Saratoga was even used to bring American servicemen home through Operation Magic Carpet. Then the war ended, and the carrier was no longer needed. That was when Saratoga's fate changed. She was selected for Operation Crossroads, a series of atomic weapons tests carried out at Bikini Atoll. The basic idea was simple: place a fleet of ships in the lagoon and see what a nuclear explosion would do to them. On July 1, 1946, the first test took place. It was called Able. The atomic bomb exploded in the air above the fleet. Saratoga was damaged, but she remained afloat. And that created the first problem. The carrier had survived an atomic blast. 3.5 weeks later, she would face something different. On July 25th, the second bomb was detonated underwater. It exploded roughly 90 feet below the surface. This was Test Baker, and the underwater explosion behaved very differently from the first one. The water itself became part of the blast. A massive column of radioactive water, debris, and spray was thrown upward before crashing back down across the lagoon and the ships surrounding the explosion. Saratoga was only about 500 yards from the detonation point. She was not simply hit by a shockwave. The blast, the water, and the damage to the ship combined to make the situation critical. But the most important fact became clear only after the explosion. Saratoga had not disappeared. She was sinking, and the U.S. Navy still had a chance to save her. After the Baker explosion, Saratoga was still close enough to the surface to be seen. The carrier had been badly damaged, but she had not immediately vanished beneath the lagoon. From a distance, it could still look like a salvage operation was possible. But there was a problem that had nothing to do with the ship's engines, pumps, or hull: radiation. The underwater blast had turned the lagoon itself into part of the contamination problem. Radioactive water and debris had been thrown across the surrounding ships, coating surfaces that sailors would normally need to reach in order to inspect or repair them. That changed the entire operation. Before Baker, rescuing a damaged ship was mainly an engineering problem. After Baker, it was also a radiation problem. The Navy began studying the contaminated ships and attempting to decontaminate them. Crews washed surfaces with water and took radiation measurements to determine where people could safely work. But Saratoga was already taking on water, and every minute mattered. The closer men came to the damaged carrier, the more radiation exposure became a concern. The usual methods of damage control were no longer enough. The ship could not simply be boarded and repaired as if it had been damaged in an ordinary naval battle. The environment around it had become dangerous. And this is where Saratoga's story becomes very different from that of a normal sunken warship. The problem was not that the Navy did not know how to salvage a carrier. The problem was that the carrier had been used as part of a nuclear weapons experiment. The same explosion that sank Saratoga had contaminated the area around her. As the hours passed, the carrier settled lower into the lagoon. The waterline climbed over the hull. The flight deck disappeared. The ship was losing the fight against the water, while the people trying to reach her were fighting a completely different enemy. Eventually, there was no practical way to bring Saratoga back. About 7.5 hours after the Baker explosion, the carrier sank beneath the surface. A ship that had survived years of war was now lying on the bottom of Bikini Lagoon. But Saratoga had not simply been lost. She had been deliberately placed in the middle of one of the most important nuclear tests in history. And that created a question that would remain long after the ship disappeared. If the Navy could not safely recover Saratoga immediately, what would happen to the wreck afterward? The answer would determine why the carrier is still underwater today. Once USS Saratoga reached the bottom of Bikini Lagoon, the question was no longer how to keep her afloat. The question was whether there was any reason to bring her back. By then, Saratoga was no longer a functioning warship. She had been fatally damaged by the Baker test, contaminated by radioactive material, and removed from active service shortly afterward. The Navy had little practical reason to spend enormous resources recovering a ship that had already completed its military life. And there was another problem. The wreck itself had become part of the evidence from Operation Crossroads. Saratoga was one of the ships used to measure what a nuclear explosion could do to a real naval fleet. Leaving her in the lagoon preserved part of that history on the seafloor. But that does not mean the wreck was simply abandoned and forgotten. The Bikini Lagoon became the resting place of several ships involved in the tests, creating an underwater record of the experiment. Saratoga remained there. Over the decades, the ocean began changing the ship in ways that no navy could reverse. Metal corroded. Open compartments filled with seawater. The flight deck and superstructure slowly became part of the underwater environment. Yet the basic outline of the carrier survived. And today, Saratoga is not a mystery because nobody knows where she is. Her location is known. Divers can reach the wreck. The reason she remains underwater is much more straightforward. She was sunk by a nuclear test, contaminated after the explosion, and had no remaining military value that justified the enormous difficulty of recovering her. There was simply no practical reason to raise her. And that is what makes Saratoga different from many famous shipwrecks. She did not disappear during a battle and wait decades to be discovered. She was deliberately placed in a nuclear test area, survived the first explosion, was destroyed by the second, and then became part of the history that the tests created. The carrier that once launched aircraft across the Pacific now rests beneath the same water where the United States tested the future of naval warfare. USS Saratoga is still underwater because, after everything the Navy had put her through, the most logical place for her was no longer a shipyard. It was the bottom of Bikini Lagoon. There is one more reason Saratoga matters. The wreck is not simply the remains of an aircraft carrier. It is physical evidence of a moment when the United States was trying to understand whether the world's largest naval weapons could survive the arrival of the atomic age. Saratoga represents the opposite result. She survived the first test, but the underwater explosion exposed how devastating nuclear weapons could be against ships surrounded by water. And unlike a ship lost in combat, Saratoga did not disappear into an unknown ocean. She remained exactly where the experiment left her, on the bottom of Bikini Lagoon, surrounded by the other remnants of Operation Crossroads.